If an ideal agreement isn't possible, is an imperfect agreement better than the status quo? So that's the subject that I will try to tackle. And the subtitle of my talk would be, Can we make lemonade? I have no idea if this is an idiom that works outside of the United States, but the basic point is if you have lemons, which are generally sour, sometimes it is possible to make lemonade, which can be a nice thing to drink. So that's what I will try to address. All right, let me start with just a few technical assumptions that I think are contextually important and I think are relatively accurate, but perhaps can be challenged by some folks here. First, I think we have to recognize that at this point, North Korea has said, and we have very little reason to believe otherwise, that they have consolidated a nuclear deterrent force, and that probably there are relatively few remaining technical constraints in terms of where it might take that force in the future. To be sure, there are things that it could do if it wanted to, and there are questions about reliability and robustness and safety and surety that I think from a perspective of a state that has had many nuclear weapons would be important questions to try to address. But from the standpoint of North Korea, may be secondary in importance to other things. Thinking about additional things that North Korea has been working on and might continue or want to do so in the future, and which also thus might be things that would be useful to try to prevent in terms of future development. Obviously, there has been efforts to develop solid rocket motors for longer range systems. Part of that also relates to North Korea's intention to have a submarine-launched ballistic missile that would go on a submerged delivery system. I think there's been speculation publicly about constraints on North Korea's ability to manage the production of heavy TELs, the transport, erecting, launching vehicles that carry ICBMs. There are questions about the durability and survivability of its long-range reentry vehicles. And then lastly, there's probably some question about its design process and the extent to which it has miniaturized certain design features that would allow it to have more confidence about their survival on long intercontinental flights. The second point I would make in relation to these things is that all of those may be important for the future, but today, because North Korea probably has a nuclear force posture that requires very low levels of readiness, these things are not as relevant today. Let me also offer some political contextual assumptions. First, I think we can read the history of negotiations that Heung laid out this morning as essentially North Korea's way of agreeing to some kinds of constraints, but never ultimately to denuclearization. And so I think if you draw a line from that trajectory till today, it is highly unlikely that North Korea agrees to any kind of denuclearization, particularly as CDID. You know, we can take up the question about whether complete denuclearization, as discussed by Shen Lee, might be different than these things, but personally I think these semantics are less important in terms of what might be negotiated and verified. The kinds of constraints that North Korea has agreed in the past have largely been temporal constraints. It has sought to avoid rigorous declarations, it has sought to avoid comprehensive inspections. And even when it agreed to these things, I think we can probably guess that it never had any intention to actually give up important parts of the program, given the number of roadblocks that North Korea put in the way of making real deep progress in moving from disablement towards dismantlement. I think it's also fair to say at this point that North Korean The perception of nuclear weapons in North Korea's national security strategy is that they are very important and probably will grow in importance to Kim Jong-un going forward. I think we see that in the discussion about whether the bloody nose threats, the preemptive threats from the United States. I think in connection then to the discussion of the Libya model, I think that reinforces the incentive to retain nuclear weapons. If North Korea actually follows through on the Byungjin line, and uses the possession of nuclear weapons as part of a defense conversion strategy that would allow it to shrink its conventional military and pour more money into the economy. In that case, nuclear weapons also become more important. And then lastly, if you look at the sequence of ideas laid out in the Panmunjom Declaration and also referenced in the Singapore Summit statement, you also see an idea that through this process of military-to-military dialogue and CBMs, if there is some sort of phased conventional disarmament or sort of reducing of tensions, in some ways that might also actually make nuclear weapons more important for North Korea as a deterrent. And so I kind of wonder, does the Panmunjom Declaration actually inadvertently delay denuclearization? I realize that might be a controversial question. So if you take these assumptions, then I think it's important that we reframe the question and the objective from today's perspective as opposed to where we were prior to June 12th, prior to April 27th, and even into the end of last year. And I think for me, at this point, even if it's difficult to do so from a political standpoint, the United States and South Korea in particular need to begin to prepare for a negotiated outcome in which North Korea retains nuclear weapons, pending final achievement of CVID or denuclearization or complete disarmament or whatever term of art you want to use, for the foreseeable future. We can define foreseeable future however you want, but they have them today and they're going to have them tomorrow and they're probably going to have them next year and the year after that, and maybe decades into the future. This outcome is suboptimal. As Steve Miller said this morning, the US has spent 25 years trying to avoid this outcome through coercive diplomacy and has failed. I think it's time to admit that this is a failure and come up with an alternative approach that recognizes that even though this is a failure, there are options that are better than the status quo. And the status quo, particularly in terms of no constraints on the program going and an erosion of sanctions, or a status quo in which this process breaks down, we return to where we were last fall amidst efforts to put the North Korean regime under some sort of extreme stress. I think the idea of extreme stress on states with nuclear weapons is inherently dangerous and something to be avoided. So, capping or denuking? Capping, I think, has started to become a little bit more acceptable in the discourse on this issue in Washington, but not fully yet, in large part because the Trump administration continues to put forward a strong emphasis on denuclearization, saying that this is what Kim Jong-un promised, and that the US intends to hold him to that promise. And so they haven't wanted to default to something less than denuclearization or recognize it. But I think this is actually a false and unhelpful dichotomy. Right? Denuclearization can be a process. You don't have to define a specific point in time or a specific technical standpoint for what the end of that looks like in order to recognize that capping can be a useful thing that happens first. It will take time. Maybe it's decades, certainly not months. US discourse, I think, is starting to recognize this now, to include in statements from US government officials. You might think of capping as a base camp, if you will, towards this summit of ultimate denuclearization, and that along the way it could have important subsidiary benefits, like changing the incentives that North Korea has to stick with the process, lowering levels of readiness in its nuclear forces, even encouraging transparency depending on how it might be constructed. In this regard, I think it's possible, and North Korea, you might be able to read signals in this direction, that it is willing to accept near to midterm constraints on the size of its arsenal and the posture of that arsenal. We're talking about future weapons, not existing ones, right? Although posture relates to the existing arsenal too. I would, even if you want to challenge that, which I think is totally fine, at least it's more acceptable and plausible to think about this option than CVID or some sort of partial rollback. With news reporting this morning that the position that the US has gone to North Korea with consistently over the last several months is that North Korea needs to turn over 60 to 70% of its arsenal in the next 8 months, whatever 60 to 70% actually is. So I think if you accept this idea of capping, that it needs to focus on stopping qualitative and quantitative improvements, and in particular with a focus on future weapons developments in the area of unfinished technology advancement, and that from a deterrent stability standpoint, this is important. There are things that North Korea could do in the future that we would not want them to do from a stability point of view. And so it's important to lock in the arsenal that they have today rather than wait on some magical thinking for an arsenal that might be much worse going forward. All right. So what might some objectives of a capping agreement look like? I think we can look to the Iran model as a useful, not model per se, but a useful suggestion for the kinds of constraints that might be introduced. So if you think of the JCPOA as an effort to stabilize the Iran nuclear crisis, a lot of that stability came through the breakout time that was calculated, that went with centrifuge constraints and constraints on the amount of material that Iran, enriched material that Iran would stockpile. You might think about similar kinds of stabilizing elements through comprehensive verified capping of production and a recessed deterrence posture when it comes to North Korea, measured in time, similarly, or in space, or in predictability about certain types of behavior. Necessarily harder in the case of North Korea than in Iran, where you had an existing IAEA relationship and agreed measures on what the IAEA could do there, where you're not starting from that baseline with North Korea today, and so this would take clearly a long time to negotiate and implement, and yet you can still see that this prospect could be useful. Over time, it should also probably involve other measures that would change the cost calculus for North Korea, both in negative ways and in positive ways. So in negative terms, the transparency that would have to go with this kind of concept increases North Korea's vulnerability. That could be managed in an incremental way so that there's not being too much asked of North Korea up front that might not be permissible given security perceptions. On the positive side, you can also imagine certain kinds of incentives that change the interests of North Korean scientists through scientist redirection types of activities that have been used elsewhere. All right, let me offer a couple technical and political considerations before I wrap up. From a technical point of view, if you were to try to do some sort of capping like this is an unprecedented challenge. We have arms control agreements between the United States and Soviet Union, which focused on certain types of facilities and capabilities. You have non-proliferation and safeguards that are focused primarily on fissile material and certain ways to measure it. We're talking here about an entire nuclear program in which you would want to monitor a wide range of activity, much of which there aren't evolved protocols for doing, the technologies for doing so are uncertain, and yet, even though it's unprecedented, our contention, as some of my colleagues and I have thought about this and looked at this issue, is that there are technologies that could be used off the shelf in novel configurations to add to the stability that you're seeking through verified comprehensive capping. It would require thinking a little bit differently about the division of labor that might exist between different parties to an agreement. And in particular, I think the tendency to come at these things from sort of a rigid institutional perspective would have to be overcome. If you ask the IAEA personnel today what mission they are prepared to undertake in North Korea, they are prepared to undertake the traditional IAEA mandate in North Korea. Undoubtedly, if you were to get some sort of capping agreement, the IAEA would have to do more, and yet there's a gap there in terms of what they're prepared to do. Third, I think we'd have to think about this in a very layered approach. You could have monitoring of fissile material sites, you could have certain kinds of monitoring of sites that would be declared to hold missiles or warheads or pits or whatever, but that you would also want to add on top of this other kinds of things to include an import-export monitoring regime, like what was done in the JCPOA through the procurement channel, but more. Right? I think you'd want to figure out, use that kind of arrangement as not only something where you look at individual activities, but as a broad bellwether of whether North Korea is upholding its end of the bargain. We also need to rethink, I would assert, what it means to do compliance verification. In the US, this has a very legalistic framework behind it that was negotiated primarily in arms control agreements with the Soviet Union and then with Russia. And it seeks to have, as near as possible, 100% certainty in compliance determinations. You're just not going to get that in North Korea. under any imaginable circumstance. And so, if you get hung up on legalism, you can't do this. If you want to do this, you need to adopt a more political approach to compliance verification. Conversely, if you're willing to take a more political approach, that opens up a lot more what you could verify, right? And how comprehensive the agreement could be. So instead of demanding to have accountability to the gram on HEU that was produced or plutonium that's in the stockpile or whatever, you can imagine a looser framework that would try to resolve inconsistencies over time, that would accept that for any individual activity, maybe you have a 10% probability of detection, but across the whole program, if you were to see systematic cheating, you'd actually have a good chance of spotting it. And then finally, I think to put the I back in this equation, irreversibility, which Shanding Lee had noted North Korea had successfully negotiated out, I think it's useful to also consider a broader understanding of irreversibility. That primarily had technical meaning in CVID, but I think it also has useful political meaning. Transparency is in many ways irreversible. North Korea says something is a certain place and shows you that it is a certain place, and you're able to monitor whether it moves from that place. That is a certain kind of irreversible transparency. All right, lastly, some political considerations. This is going to cost a lot. Right? You have to say that up front. By and large, I've ignored so far questions of cost, but all of this presumably would have quid pro quos and linkages. Is the cost as much as CVID? No. But, it's probably a cost that many states should be willing to pay for the stability that would come from it. Big questions, though, who will pay, right? In the Quito model, that answered that question in a certain way. In the 2006 to 2008 six-party talks, it answered that question in a certain way. We'll have to renegotiate that question now. An important part of that, particularly as we look to precedent set by the agreed framework and the six-party talks, is what do we do about North Korea's nuclear energy program, its civilian program, when it's on the cusp of starting a new experimental light water reactor, right? There are new facts to consider in this regard. It was interesting, the student presentation earlier that looked at the different sort of models of nuclear cooperation, and then Francesca's point about normalization. We were ready to give North Korea nuclear reactors even though it was out of compliance with the NPT in 1994. I think we better be prepared to answer that question today. Right? Status is also really important. Right? One of the most important political things that that challenge Francesca's assertion about normalization is that because North Korea left the NPT, because it's been in violation of all these things, whether real, legally, imagined, or otherwise, it's hard for states to agree to recognize North Korea as a state with nuclear weapons. And politically here in South Korea, that's really hard, right? And for different reasons, I think it's hard for US administrations, largely because they don't want to admit that they've failed for the last 30 years. Is capping an implicit recognition of status? Well, it probably depends on how it's contextualized and framed. If it's seen as a waypoint towards denuclearization, maybe you can punt that issue enough to manage the politics. But certainly it will be a challenge. Resilience is also a huge issue. Past agreements with North Korea have failed to be implemented for reasons that are complex and not the fault of any single party, but all of the parties. To include the US Congress as a party to these agreements, right? And so I think thinking about how you would insulate a capping agreement, given how opaque North Korea is, given the difficulty that would come with monitoring and verification, how do you insulate it when inevitably there will emerge inconsistencies between what you observe and what it said it had? Are those indications of cheating? Well, that's going to be the political framework that they're discussed in. How do you define a pathway to resolve these kinds of inconsistencies so that it doesn't introduce political impetus for opponents of this kind of agreement to blow it up? Fourth political challenge is that you have divergent threat perception between the US and South Korea and Japan, and certainly also China and Russia, and questions about how then this kind of arrangement would relate to North Korea's other WMD programs. Right? You would have missiles involved in this kind of arrangement, but how do you deal with chem and bio? North Korea has a demonstrated pretty significant and advanced chemical weapons capability. Can this be a stable agreement, stable arrangement, if you don't also tackle that in some way at the same time? And then lastly, as Steve mentioned earlier, the uncertainty in US politics around this question are really interesting. Trump has had a free hand. He's had almost no criticism from Republicans about the lack of content in the Singapore summit and the sort of wasting of political strategic capital that had been accrued over the course of 2017 and early this year. After the midterms, if there's impeachment proceedings, this question might look pretty different, right? Who knows where that goes, but that kind of uncertainty, I think, is a significant challenge. All right. Lastly, this is something that we've done at the Carnegie Endowment quite a bit of work on, to include my colleague Tong Zhao, who's here, and we have a lot of it on our website to include a notional roadmap for what this would look like and all of the technical things that would have to go with it. So I invite you to have a look. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dalton, for your nice summary concerning this issue. And the next speaker